We can now look at our first official appendage, the upper limb, starting with the humerus. The first part of the humerus is the head of the humerus, and this is the region that will articulate with the scapula. More specifically, the head of the humerus has a chunk of articular cartilage on it, and that will articulate with the articular cartilage on the glenoid cavity of the scapula. Some other structures of the proximal humerus, the part closest to the trunk, are the anatomical neck and surgical neck. What this means is that if you can imagine the humerus moving in your pectoral girdle, uh, it will rotate around the anatomical neck. So it's just behind the head of the humerus. But your humerus tends to break at the surgical neck, kind of a skinny part inferior to some of the other structures of the humerus. Specifically, those other structures include the greater and lesser tubercles. This is basically there's a big bump and a little bump. Those are for muscle attachments, as we'll talk about in the next unit. In between the tubercles is the intertubercular groove, or sulcus if you prefer. And just like the tubercles are for muscle attachments, so too is the intertubercular groove. There's lots of muscles that attach to the humerus because, check me out, I can move my humerus in a lot of ways and with a lot of strength. I'd surprise you. I wouldn't surprise you. I'm very weak, but I know my anatomy. Let's move on. On the shaft of the humerus, or based on our previous lessons, we could say on the diaphysis of the humerus, we can find the deltoid tuberosity. Now, this is also for muscle attachments, and in this case, they gave the structure a nice name so that you know which muscle will attach here. The deltoid, your shoulder muscle, will attach here. Now let's look at some of these inferior structures on the humerus, or I should say distal, the structures farther away from the trunk. Include, what is it? Hey, what's that little thing doing here? That's the ulna. The ulna will help us understand these inferior structures because these structures are mostly for bone to attach to the humerus, your forearm bones. So look at the ulna. The ulna has, I kind of call it a cookie monster. You know, it has a mouth shape on it that's shaped like a C or maybe a U for ulna. And that mouth is called the trochlear notch. And its job is to bite on the humerus at a structure called the trochlea. Trochlea means pulley. I don't really use pulleys much in my normal life, but I could envision a pulley being shaped kind of like flared on two ends and narrow in the middle. And then if you wanted to lift a heavy box or something, you would throw a rope up over this pulley. So that's kind of like how the trochlea and the ulna work. The trochlear notch will bite onto this pulley shape and pivot on the trochlea. Now the thing is that when the ulna is doing that, as you flex your elbow joint and you bring your forearm up really tight, these chunks of bone on the ulna are going to want to jam up on your humerus. So there's actually grooves, little fossae, little shallow like depressions on your humerus to fit these chunks of bone. This top chunk of bone on the ulna is called the olecranon, and it will fit into the olecranon fossa on the posterior side of the humerus. The lower chunk of bone on the ulna is called the coronoid process, and it will fit into the coronoid fossa on the anterior side of the humerus. This is better viewed in some of the videos and things you have access to, but just try to think of it as the U shape bites onto the trochlea, and then where your fingers and your thumb would dig into the trochlea, there are little depressions right there. So the one is called the olecranon fossa, and one is called the coronoid fossa. That's looking good, but we're not done yet. Because, hey, what's that doing here? A radius just popped up. This is the other bone of your forearm, and it's going to sit right next to the ulna. So if the trochlea is all about connecting the ulna to the humerus, the capitulum is all about connecting the radius to the humerus. There's a part of the radius, it's called the head, and it's going to nestle right up against the capitulum of the humerus. So why is it called the capitulum? Well, think of the root cap. Anytime you see cap, like C-A-P, or sep, like C-E-P, you should be thinking head. If you put a cap on your head, that's your head. If you're Captain America, you're the head of the Avengers. If you're decapitated, you are removed of your head. So capitulum is referring to the head. And what touches the capitulum? The head of the radius. Pretty good name. Here's the thing though. When you flex your elbow and these bones are getting tight against your humerus, the head of the radius is going to need somewhere to go. The radial fossa is a little indentation in the humerus for the bony, sticky, outy chunks on the head of the radius to fit into. Again, videos are better for this, so you'll have access to those. Finally, there are these two little epicondyles poking out of the distal end of the humerus, medial epicondyle and lateral epicondyle. Make sure you know which is medial and which is lateral. That's as easy as just finding the head of the humerus. The head of the humerus will always point towards the midline of my body. So this will always be the medial side. I don't want the head of my humerus poking out into space because that won't make a joint. Okay, now we can look at the radius and ulna officially, but we've already named a lot of the parts. Especially on the ulna, we started with the trochlear notch, so the whole cartilaginous region that will articulate with the humerus. We talked about the olecranon, that big chunk of bone, which, by the way, is this. That bony, sticky, outy part of your elbow is your olecranon. And we talked about the coronoid process. Now, I mentioned that the ulna and radius are going to nestle right up next to each other. So the head of the radius actually fits into an adorable little pillow on the ulna called the radial notch. And because the head of the radius is like a round disc, this notch is kind of also shaped like a C. And the head of the radius will just slide in there. On the ulna, we also have the ulnar tuberosity. Remember, a tuberosity is a bumpy or rough patch where muscles will attach. And on the bottom, at the head of the ulna, since they're always trying to name one end of these long bones head, so in this case, we'll call the distal end the head, and we'll find a little styloid process. Remember, a stylus is what people my dad's age use on their Blackberries. It's probably what you use on a tablet. So styloid means shaped like a stylus, like a pen. Okay, let's look at the radius. We already mentioned the head of the radius. Just like the ulna has a tuberosity, the radius has a tuberosity. And if we look at the distal end of the radius, we can't call it the head because we already called the proximal end the head. So we don't call it anything. But we do say, oh, look, another styloid process, this one on the radius. Now all we do is recognize that there's lots of articular cartilage on the ends of these bones, and we slap in the interosseous membrane, which is a wide flat ligament helping to stabilize the connection between the ulna and radius. So before we finish with the bones in the wrist and hand, I want you to notice that the styloid processes of the radius and ulna form a shape that's kind of like this. It makes a big U shape. And the styloid processes are going to help capture all of the wrist bones. So if you want to know how the arm and the hand are connected, it's through those styloid processes and wrist bones. And here they are now. Bones of the wrist and hand. There are 8 carpal bones. They're not the most fun to learn, which means we need a mnemonic to study them. So I listed a few mnemonic devices on the slide. I always went with the old generic one about Sally going to a party, but one of my students taught me this one. So long to pinky, here comes the thumb. And I really like that one because when you say the word pinky, you should be on the pinky end of the wrist if you're looking from an anterior view. And when you say the word thumb, you should be on the thumb side. So the key to all of these mnemonics that I know of that start with S is you have to find the first carpal bone that starts with S, and that's scaphoid. And scaphoid is a pretty large bone in the wrist. It's under the radius, so you need to make sure you're starting always on the radius side of the carpal bones with the scaphoid. And the mnemonic is so long to pinky. So I do my S, scaphoid. Next is lunate, so long. Then triquetrum. And last is pisiform, so long to pinky. And right now I am on the pinky side of the wrist. I know this because I started on the radius side, and you know what the radius is? The radius is rad, dude. Oh, yeah. Did I tell you my one joke yet? Here's my only joke I know. What did the lifeguard say to the hippie? Oh, wait, I messed it up. Why couldn't the lifeguard rescue the hippie? He was too far out, man. Thank you. That's the only joke you'll get the whole semester. So the reason I tell you that joke is rad, dude. You have to remember rad because the radius is on the thumb side of your arm. The ulna is on the other side. So if you start this mnemonic on the radius side, by the time you get to pisiform, you should be on the pinky side. So long to pinky, and here comes the thumb. Let's do the other 4. Hamate, capitate, trapezoid, trapezium. Many of these are named after their geometric shapes and have similar names to each other, so you just got to work through them. Okay, now we just named the hand and finger bones. The wrist bones were carpals, so the hand bones are the metacarpals. So when I say hand bones, find your wrist and then go distal. All of these bones in your palm. If you cut open the palm, you're going to see the hand bones. Those are the metacarpals. And those are just named metacarpal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, starting on the wrist end. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I've just got my finger bones. Those are your phalanges, or singular is a phalanx. Now there's different kinds of phalanges. You have proximal phalanges, middle phalanges, and distal phalanges. But check out the thumb. The thumb over here, there's only 2 bones. The thumb only has a proximal and a distal phalanx, no middle phalanx. So, how many finger bones do you have? 3, 6, 9, 12, 13, 14. And 14 more on your other hand is 28. And your feet, which we'll do later, will be the same. 56 phalanges in the body.